Welcome back to Nubian Tigers Talk, a podcast brought to you by Black Princetonians, where we discuss real issues impacting our Black and Brown communities. So, Ray, since the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the protests that followed, police reform is constantly in the news, but we haven't had a show yet specifically on the topic.
Yeah, Michelle, that's really interesting. And I was kind of trying to go back and look at an article that Wesley Lowery of the Washington Post did maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, where he tried to begin to track the police killings of unarmed, in particular, Black citizens. And he found there was such an inconsistency from one police department to the next that really the Washington Post took up that mantle themselves. And they actually now have the most comprehensive list of or group of police shootings probably in the country at this point.
So we have a very special show today. We have a guest who's going to be talking to us from an organization that works with the police, as opposed to our normal guests who are criticizing the police. So it's a pleasure for us today to welcome Dominique Johnson, who's from the Center for Policing Equity. Now, Dominique's bio on the website describes her as a racial justice warrior on the very first sentence. So, I mean, you can't get a better description than that, can you? But in addition to that, she also serves as the Senior Director of Community Engagement at the Center for Policing Equity. Dominique believes in the power of the community, meaning its lived experiences, expertise, and collective influence should anchor a quest to uplift community-centered, equitable policing practices. She has grassroots expertise in helping to lead systemic change on youth civic engagement, gun violence prevention, and domestic and wartime sexual violence against women. So we are very pleased to welcome with us today, Dominique Johnson, to the show.
Of course, thank you for having me. My bio always sounds really interesting when other people read it back. So thank you for queuing that up.
Welcome.
Okay. So since you are our first guest who has actually worked in association with the police, can you tell our listeners a little about the Center for Policing Equity and what the focus of your organization is?
Absolutely. So I like to say we work to make policing less racist and less deadly. We are made up of research and data scientists. We have public health experts, community engagement professionals like myself, and we use qualitative and quantitative data to build more fair and just public safety systems. And I will say for our history, in 2004, there was a first ever policing and racial bias conference that brought together Dr. Philip Atiba Goff and Dr. Tracy Kazee, who's my direct supervisor. Both are co-founders, and at the time, Tracy was command staff at the Denver Police Department. And Phil tells the story really well. He'll always say, well, I was just this young kid and I went up to Tracy and I'm like, why are police racist? Why is this happening this way? I need to know more. And she's like, well, come to Denver, come and sit with me for a week. Let me teach you all about policing. And then you'll really understand that it's a larger problem. It's a connected problem. And what you're saying is what you're saying. So, and so they came together in 2008 and established CPE, which is really to promote collaboration between social science researchers and law enforcement. And we work to identify disparities within policing. So we analyze the data that departments either already collect, or we identify data that they should collect for those disparities. And we assess sort of those different disparities within this report called a city report. That's a part of our Justice Navigator portfolio. And it looks at things like use of force, stops for arrests, and then you assess, like, do these problems belong to the police and can they control for those versus what are disparities that police departments cannot control for? So think about poverty or external factors within the community that influence the way in which folks are being enforced. And then we give that information back to communities and law enforcement, and we leverage policymakers to be a part of that discussion to say, here's a community decision-making process. Here's how we want to reduce those disparities. Give us the right resources and the right tools to solve these larger problems.
So one of the problems that we have in criminal justice reform on the grassroots side is that, we're often missing the data that tells us, for example, how many Black men have been killed by the police, how many Black women have been raped by the police, et cetera. So, so data is really important. Can you give us an example of how a project that worked well for you guys that was data driven and why it was so important to get access to the data?
Yes, so I have a couple of different things, but I'll set it up this way. So we have our marquee programming. So think about the National Justice Database, and we call that NJD. And so this is the nation's first database that tracks national statistics on police behavior. So standardizing data collection processes and spurring the data-driven reforms from participating departments. So a department will come to us and say, hey, we really want to work and look at these disparities. These are the things that we know we have some issues on. We want to work with our community to make them better. So I'm going to go into a couple of examples specifically on those in a second to give you some context. We also have CompStat for Justice, which is C4J. And this enables, you may have heard CompStat as a tool that folks use within policing. And this enables law enforcement agencies to identify contexts and conditions that create risk for biased behaviors to emerge. So you're thinking about smart data collection and analysis. We provide ongoing thought partnership, and C4J allows us to design these data-informed strategies and recommendations so that departments can make changes to these policies and practices required to reduce the risk of the biased outcomes. So think about overtime for officers, thinking about staffing within a department. How do those factors play into how police show up to a call for service? And then we also have what we consider our redesign work, which I'll also talk about. You may have heard about Ithaca and Tompkins County and the big push to disband their police department. So I'll go into that in a second. But I do want to touch on like our results. So in the 25 cities to which we have delivered scientific products, police departments have seen that change, right? You've seen a 26% drop in use of force. You've seen a 13% decrease in injuries to police officers, and you've seen 25 fewer arrests. And all of this has happened without crime surging, because all you hear is crime's gonna rise, crime's gonna rise. And that's not true. That's not true. And if you bring these results to scale, I say 25 cities, but we're doing so much other things and we're getting audits and pulling in more data every day. But bringing these to scale can lead to those fewer officer injuries, fewer civilian injuries, fewer lawsuits against police departments, and Black and brown people being at the center of what policing should look like within their communities. And so with the NJD work, I will say that we worked in Berkeley, California. So in 2018, we delivered our first National Justice Database report to Berkeley. And in 2020, building on that credibility, we supported community members in Berkeley to reduce the scope or the footprint, as they say, of their police department. And so we used the data from that National Justice Database report. Community members submitted their data-informed recommendations to the police department. And the major recommendation was to eliminate low-level traffic enforcement by the Berkeley Police Department. And so in February 2021, the City Council in Berkeley approved that legislation to eliminate these traffic stops for minor offenses. And we're also engaged in ongoing conversations to support the Berkeley PD to make staff reductions and to retain younger, more diverse officers. And so what that means is that when you have more younger, younger officers, you have officers of color, there's a different, more progressive mindset because people are coming from their lived experiences and bringing that into their profession. So it's like representation. It doesn't mean that they're not going to buy into the culture of policing. That's a very tight-knit culture, and we can go into that. But what it does mean is that there is hope for more progressive stances, maybe more progressive behaviors, attitudes, and outcomes. As far as the traffic enforcement as well, it always becomes a thing where if you're stopping folks for traffic violations, they're going to already probably be getting into the criminal justice system right there. If it's that or they're losing their lives, because you're stopping people to say, oh, your taillight's out. Well, I probably can't afford to fix my taillight, sir. That's why it's out. So, so now I got to get a ticket or I got to go to jail, and that already starts that cycle. Or you stop me for a traffic violation and you think I'm a danger, and now I'm dead, and now this is a national story. So being able to have Berkeley do something so high level, and it seems very basic, but it's something that no one has really ever thought about in this way, and many other departments are thinking about doing this stuff. When you're talking about sort of that redesign work, we worked in Ithaca. So the city of Ithaca and in Tompkins County, New York, in 2020, we worked with Ithaca's Mayor, Cervante Myrick, and at the time it was County Administrator Jason Molino. And they wanted a comprehensive overhaul. Oh my goodness, they were asking for so many things, but we analyzed their 911 call data. So that is looking at where officers are going, who's calling 911, why are they calling 911, and it's like calls for service. Gathering community input through surveys, we did town halls, there were so many public forums where people could scream at the mayor and say, you need to do better. And then we helped their Reimagining Public Safety Collaborative to create these comprehensive set of recommendations. And some of these recommendations, the biggest one that has caused so much overhaul is disbanding the police department and replacing it with a public safety department led by a civilian director. And this department's going to have 3 components. So it would have an armed response unit, it would have an unarmed response unit, and it would have a mental health response unit. And then another recommendation was to demilitarize the city police and the county sheriff's office. And so actions that happened from the officials in that governmental space was that the police union, which people don't hear often about police unions in a positive way, they put out a statement supporting most of that plan that came out.
Really?
Yeah. So I was working on this project, and it was tough. Like, it was contentious, and like it felt like every time the community would lift up something, the union would come out and say, well, we have recommendations, or we're doing these things. And
yeah, I mean, Michelle and I were talking the other day about unions, and I mean, you know, we're both from New York. We know how powerful the New York Police Department union is, and how they put, you know, certain mayors in office, and they may put another guy in office that has an affiliation with the union. So
unions are their own tough beast. And I will say that I think when you are talking about this redesign work, or when you're thinking about communities having, you know, a foot in this game, you probably won't get many places without a buy-in or an understanding of unions. I'm learning about this work. You know, I've worked in social justice my entire career, but never in policing in this way. And so this is something every day I come to work, and people who leave the police department or leave public office or things come to work for CPE. And so the knowledge that you gain every day is like, how did this work? Or, oh my goodness, I didn't know that this could happen here, but it can't happen here. And it's local. Policing is local. And so when you're hearing things about, you know, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, wonderful that there's an accountability that people want to push for those things, also recognizing that policing is local. You know, what happens in this jurisdiction may happen in this jurisdiction, but it's not required to do so. And so as people talk about local elections and things too, everything is local. So that's why communities really should be pushing for the local context that they want to see. Because we work in some places where, you know, I'm Black, so I'm always a little biased around when it comes to thinking about like how policing runs. But I've worked in places where they're like, police function, it's great. It's, you know, we just want to fix a few things. And we help those departments and those communities do that. What I'm coming from, you know, I was born and raised in Baltimore. So for me, I'm like, ooh, I'm not really, you know, and then I lived the last 10 years in New York. So it's not for me. I'm like, police. Oh, do we have anybody else we can call? And so it's ultimately, right. I'm trying to make sure that communities are standing up their resources, right? Because everybody comes and they're saying, oh, we want to change this, or we want to change this policy. And you have no idea how a police department actually runs every day. We want to cut funding. You cut the funding, and all the single moms who work as receptionists or county administrative staff or anybody in the department, they're losing their jobs. Your community's suffering because they were the breadwinners in their family. So it's a domino effect. So really trying to get communities to understand the systems and structures that they are hoping to change, but then also saying, put your ducks in a row. Police departments don't want to come to social service calls either. Do you have a social service infrastructure? How many Black doctors do you have? How many nurses? What does your proactive investment look like? And then everybody's looking like, the departments are saying, well, we're underfunded and we don't have the resources or the training. Communities, we're underfunded, we don't have the resources and training. So policymakers, you're up. What funding and training and resources can you offer us? And then getting everybody to understand that that's where the push needs to be, educating yourselves on those systems, making sure there's a localized context with recommendations and solutions, and then pushing it forward. And I think Ithaca is a really great example of how all of those entities work together to sort of lead and push that work forward.
So I have a question about what kind of effort police departments made to cooperate with you guys and giving you the kind of data and information that you're looking for, because let's face it, I mean, they're not, we're wondering, how you guys work that out with these various municipalities, in working together with these guys.
I think it's because we have that in-house connection, right? So my boss and co-founder of CPE was a former command staff, also deputy commissioner for NYPD, and every law enforcement agency that we work with, we have partners that are relationship managers with them to help them through this process, to help them understand like the importance of data, why it's important to collect it this way. I remember we worked with a department who wasn't collecting for race data. They wanted to work with us. And it's like, how do you prove you have disparities if you're not collecting for the one thing that is helpful? Smaller agencies as well, their records management systems are not up to par to be able to collect and do the data collection that would be robust enough to be able to analyze. So you're facing a lot of these data barriers on the side of the departments, as well as missing the mandates for a standardized collection process. And so that's feeding the wheel of, I can't share my data and I won't share it because it's not up to par. And so we're helping with our law enforcement, former law enforcement folks are coming to the table and saying, this is not a scary process. Transparency is all about building up your infrastructure so that when people come into your house, it's not a falling house of cards. It is, I can show you what I'm doing because we're all working towards the same thing. And then when I work with the departments, I'm also saying this is customer service, right? When y'all are contracted because of my tax dollars or who I am putting in office. So if you're not providing me with good customer service, then what is your value add? What is your value add? And I tell community members that all the time. If you don't like what they're selling, you have every right to say, I'm looking for something else. And that's your right to do that. And it's helping people to understand their role within this larger public safety ecosystem, because maybe it's an alternative response. Cops are telling me, I don't want to respond to animal calls. You know what a large portion of the calls are? Animal control calls. Where's the SPCA? Can we fund the SPCA to be able to go out and get these animals? Because they're more qualified than you sending an officer out. So I think it's really, we have the unique ability at CPE to have people who are really entrenched in data. We have really forward-thinking scientists and academics. We have that law enforcement piece. We have former policymakers, and then we have community folks like me who are really pulling together to say, this is how you do it. And then donors are wanting to fund the science. They're wanting to fund these things. And we also don't charge. Like, we don't charge police departments because it's an accountability, right? If we look like we're getting paid for a service, yes, how do you prove transparency to the community? And for communities, we want that legitimacy as well to be able to be neutral arbiters to the work.
Yeah, let me circle back around to a point that you touched on briefly before. In the movement that for good or ill is called defund the police, which we all know is really just a question of asking for a reallocation of the resources to be diverted a little bit from the police and invested more in community needs. You often get this, the pushback, right? If you divert resources from the police, there'll be increased violence. And of course, that's a big political talking point now. Oh, it's increased violence. Okay, in parentheses, no police dollars have been reallocated yet. But nonetheless, it's the dog whistle, the scare that if we use the money in some other kind of way, violence will happen in the community. And you even get some really well-intentioned Black politicians who will like former President Obama, who will make those kinds of statements. So, so you obviously have had some experience where you have had a reallocation of resources, and there hasn't been increased violence. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I also, what does violence mean and how are you defining violence is also like my first thing when I hear those things. We're also in a pandemic, right? So how are you going to say, people are still needing resources. I can say in Maryland, I'm quarantining here, this is where my family is, they had a bunch of fraud cases happening with their unemployment system. And so people have been months without money. What do you do when you don't have money and you have no resources and no one's giving you any answers? Hello, crime will rise. I don't think that those things are, again, mutually exclusive. And I hesitate. I think it's the interest of now we want to refund because we're saying defund. And it's very much a conversation around, well, what have we actually done? Have we actually reallocated these resources? And if so, where's the plan? Where's the data to support that? And what are the wins and losses? We have not done a full accounting of that, I think, to make these sweeping sort of accusations or grandiose statements. I do think in Ithaca, we are in the second phase, right? Because the first phase is, here are the recommendations, here's what we should do. And then you say, oh, we want to disband a police department and create this new thing, but we have no idea how it should go. We have we have to, and it's not even implementation, right? Because you can't pass this stuff. You have to recommend what you think it will be. And then the council will then say, okay, this will be what it is. And so we're at a point now where we are working with the community again, the stakeholders again, to say, okay, what is the job of the civilian board and who takes that job and where do the funds come from? And then going through and seeing all your calls for service now, this like animal control can go here. And then you go and you talk to the animal control people, like, we don't have a resource, we can't catch dogs. So then it's like, okay, now we're back to this to say, well, then you need to propose $1.5 million to then go to animal control so that they can be able to go get these dogs. Do you have a dispatch service set up for calls that are not violent related, like violent crime related? Oh, no, we don't have that. Okay, now you have to set up a thing to be able, that's gonna cost money. That's gonna cost money to train dispatchers. It's gonna have to be a records management system. It's all of those pieces. So I think for me, it's very grandiose and it's very quick and premature to say that it has not worked. It's also local. It also takes time. It took us 400 plus years to get to this point where we're finally allowed to call policing what it is and talk about the history of it. And so you're going to need concerted time to be able to do all of these things. And now we're finally getting back outside. A lot of this work cannot happen over Zoom. It's wonderful that it is. It's connected me with so many people, but we got to be outside to be doing this work. You can't ask for community input and then the people that are directly impacted don't have internet access. How are they going to tell you what they're looking for? How are you going to know what their community is like? So I think it's premature, and I think we should really just be trying to quell some of that narrative with putting real facts on the table about what it is and what it isn't, even if it's not a catchy buzzword like defund or refund or whatever it is, just educating people with the facts and the reality.
Dominique, I have a question regarding how police, especially since there's been so much in the press recently after January 6th about so many white supremacists being in police departments and, you know, sheriff's office and you name it, they're there and they've been there for decades. How do they address weeding those kind of people out, or how do they address the recruitment of officers for their departments? Because another problem that some of these departments have, they hire people that were fired from other departments. You know, the guy that killed Tamir Rice in Ohio, in Cleveland was, you know, he was fired by another police department that he was at in Ohio, and somehow or other he got a job in Cleveland. So how did did you guys actually research that as well?
So that is a conversation, right? So in that Justice and Policing Act, they talk about this sort of disciplinary action and how we need to really be focused on making sure that officers who are sort of let go for whatever reason are not able to be hired in another jurisdiction. Again, policing being local, right now you have the window to do that. We developed, and we had an Instagram live that we are going to be putting on the website with the Chicago Police Department Chief Rainey, who is currently does the University of Chicago, and one of our scientists who talked a lot about white supremacy and the challenges that they faced and why he wanted to become a police officer and being a Black chief and all of these sort of conversations. So I definitely can share that link with you all if you're interested to learn more. But it was talking about this report that we released about white supremacy within law enforcement. And so it was a guidebook, and the guidelines were designed and developed to assist law enforcement agencies in responding to the presence of white supremacy and hate groups in policing, because white supremacist gangs and paramilitary gangs, we know they're avowed lawbreakers dedicated to racism and overthrowing the government. Like, that made the work of community engagement really hard right after January 6th, because people were fired up after the uprisings, and then they're like, what's the point of coming to the table anymore? We're seeing it, you know? Like, we see that the primary purpose of these groups is to sow hatred, and cops are a part of this. And what we have sort of worked with our law enforcement partners to say, you know, cops can't be permitted to be a part of these groups. The insurrection at this Capitol made the need to address white supremacy and hate group affiliation inside our police departments. Like, we went to our different chiefs and we talked about, like, this has existed very long, and we really need to show how dangerous it is and like work with us to create sort of these guidelines to move this forward. And it was a guideline that helped identify, discipline, and remove officers who intentionally are advocating and affiliating with hate groups or these paramilitary gangs. And it will help the agencies try to adopt some institutional values and policies and rules that will make it clear that we are not supporting white supremacist folks, and we have a no tolerance policy for that. So thinking about checking folks' social media before they're hired, thinking about who you're recruiting and why. Because ultimately, if you're saying that you want to be community centered as a CPE partner and a law enforcement agency, then you have to say that you are not going to allow groups like this to undermine your mission of being a police officer in your jurisdiction, that you're going to be committed to equitable policing and earning communities' trust. And it really applies to like all officers' communication styles and social media and their interactions, and partnering with communities and advocacy groups to identify the concerns, and then being able to build out what the appropriate responses will be. And I think for me, the one that I saw most in that guidebook was around the social media, because when you're recruiting folks, you should be, everybody, when you're looking for jobs, are looking at folks' social media. And if people are even sharing memes on Facebook, you may feel, or you may be aligned with some of that rhetoric. Even if it's just funny to you, it should at least be investigated at this point. And maybe it turns out that it's not true and you were just sharing a funny meme. I don't know, but communities should be involved in that process. Law enforcement agencies should be allowing community members to help be a part of that process. And folks should be building a recruitment strategy and an engagement strategy for new officers, because again, that community customer service model, if you're working for us, we should have the ability to put you on the spot, check your whistle, see what you got going on under the hood of your car before you're deemed appropriate to work in our departments. And so that also will be on the website too, I can share.
Okay, yes, thank you. We would love that. So given though the historical connection, as you say, took us 400 years to get here, right?
Yep.
And the fact that policing is local, I think last count, there's something like 18,000 police agencies in the United States. And we have to factor in that some of those 18,000 are in jurisdictions where the community, the larger non-persons of color community, is committed to, removing rights as opposed to upholding rights. So give us, do you have a sense of how difficult it will be ultimately for the law enforcement community as a whole to get themselves out of the clutches of white supremacy?
Oh, goodness.
That's a hard question, I know, but
Yeah,
just.
no. So I'm not contractually under this agency anymore, but I don't want to speak ill of the community because I really care about that community. But I will say I worked in one of these examples that you're talking about. The town was not collecting for race data. I got like a public infraction because of the way I was helping this community. You know, I'm an outsider coming in to help, and I'm saying that white supremacy exists and we should be down with it, burn it all. So I got, you know, people writing about me in newspapers. So I was like appalled. I'm like, wow. And my boss like, you must be doing something right because you're getting people fired up about it. And
That's it.
I'm like, I'm thinking I'm going to publicly embarrass the company. I'm like, oh my God, I got a public comment. These people are saying these terrible things. And there was an officer who, you know, had left the group that we were all working together. And it was, you know, hubbub. And it was really tough, you know, working every day with that chief to think about, you know, even when you're talking to me, you know, we have a rapport, but you gotta, your language, you know, watch how you talk. Let me walk you back through, you know, being that one Black friend in the room, trying to coach someone to success, to think about things that they didn't foresee as being problematic. Mm-hmm. And so this is the person that would be leading, you know, maybe your department. So you see how much intrinsicness is built into the culture when, if the head of your department sort of has biases or personal things that they have not encountered, the rhetoric or the culture that you're going to sort of cultivate is one that is rooted in some of those things, along with police brotherhood and protecting each other. So I do think it is going to be very difficult. I do not think that tomorrow we're going to change the world. And what I also don't want people to think is that, oh, if we just remove everything from policing, we'll be fine. You have racist healthcare systems, you have racist school systems, you have racist job systems. So I don't want people to feel despair because this is something that's the topic du jour. People are really, they have an appetite for changing this. And if you can get wins here, you can get wins anywhere, I think, because this is such a deep-rooted issue. My concern is the longevity of people doing this work, right? You're going to need young people to keep this going. You're going to need people in the streets protesting. You're going to need people who are, you know, like a CPE, giving the data and painting these real factual pictures to folks who don't understand the lived experiences and the perspectives. You're going to need your social activists lighting a fire literally to people and being like, this is how it's going to happen. You need all of those participatory elements to move this forward. And I do think you will find a lot of resistance in those smaller agencies because they don't have the infrastructure to actually do records management. So how can you prove that something is happening when you don't have the records management system? So helping them to build their, I guess, data practices and their data collection practices will ultimately be able to leverage painting a better picture, and not even a better picture, painting a picture that is understandable to people who do not have those lived experiences.
That's been fantastic.
A lot of work.
Can we go another 30 minutes, Michelle?
I always have time for you guys. If y'all have questions and you want me to come back, I'm
we definitely will have you back.
Yeah, is there something you want to leave us with as we close it out today?
Yeah, I would say y'all got to stay healthy, man. Like, please get those vaccinations so that we can keep up the work. And young people need to be a part of this. I'm young, you probably won't be able to see me because it's audio, but I'm a millennial and it's a lot. You need young people at the front of this. I'm not saying that they have all the answers, but they have the most longevity and the most passion to be the change that we probably won't see in our lifetime. And so support those protesters, support those local businesses. People are really struggling from COVID and the effects of what COVID means to their businesses, their families, their legacies. And it takes all of us to do this work. So if I can be a resource in any way and CPE can be a resource, you know where to find us at policingequity.org. And just, it's a long journey, guys. The pressure has to stay on, and whatever way that you're contributing to that is important.
Right.
Thank you so much, Dominique.
Of course.
100%. Dominique, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a fascinating and insightful discussion. And you might be young, sister, but you were laying the truth down.
Oh, please. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you
Of
so much.
course, thank you. And as you guys are, if you want to promote it and you have any graphics or anything you want to send over or clips, let us know because we'll post it on our pages and things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Incredible.
Thanks.
I appreciate the opportunity and you all have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
You too.
If you enjoyed what you heard today, visit our website, nubiantigerspodcast.com. In addition to the podcast, we also post a resource page for each subject to provide additional sources of information. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @NubianTigers, written as one word. We're also on YouTube on the Nubian Tigers podcast channel. Our podcast is hosted by Anchor FM, but if you have a favorite podcast app, we're probably on it. Just look for Nubian Tigers Talk. So we're going to close out with this episode, which is the end of our season 2
Yes.
of the podcast. Hard to believe, but we've been going for a bunch of episodes now.
I know, and I can't believe that this actually came out of our Zoom meetings together with the Nubian Tigresses, and that the Wake Up podcast was it was a labor of love. It's been a labor of love.
It is, but also enjoyable.
Yep. And you know what? So just to let our listening audience know, we're going to be on hiatus until the Labor Day holiday. But when we resume, we'll discuss the return to Broadway of Black producers and playwrights and actors and how they've managed to navigate the past year of forced inactivity due to COVID, and also the impact of the murders of unarmed Black people across this country. And Michelle, we're also going to try to talk to a couple of young Black entrepreneurs who have made their individual marks in 2 very different markets.
So hang in there, people, because season 3 is going to be just as interesting and exciting as our 2 previous seasons. So we hope to see you in the fall. And during our hiatus, we'll be posting reminders of the shows that we've done in case you missed any episodes or you need an update on what's been happening. You'll be able to catch it while we're on hiatus. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge with you next time.
Wake up, wake up, wake up.